At the edge of one of the harshest deserts on Earth, 1,000 years of human belief is carved into the face of a single cliff. Not one temple. Not 10. Almost 500 caves, cut by hand into a wall of soft rock on the rim of the Gobi Desert, in the far west of China. Inside them, gods float across the ceilings. Giant Buddhas sit in the dark. Painted figures crowd every surface, tens of thousands of them, in colors that have not faded in over 1,000 years. This is Dunhuang. And the caves are called Mogao, the caves of the 1,000 Buddhas. For most of us, the story of the ancient world is told through stone. Pyramids, temples, walls. But the greatest treasure ever found here was not stone at all. It was paper. Behind one sealed wall, in a single hidden room, sat the largest collection of ancient documents ever discovered in one place. And when it was finally opened, after 900 years in the dark, it was scattered to the far corners of the planet within a decade. So sit with 3 questions. Why would anyone build the richest library of art and faith on Earth here, at the empty edge of a desert, 1,000 miles from anywhere? How did a fragile world of paint and paper survive for over a millennium when stone monuments crumbled? And what was hidden in that sealed room, and who took it away? This is the story of Dunhuang, the soul of the Silk Road. Chapter 1. The oasis at the edge of the world. To understand the caves, you first have to understand where you are standing. Dunhuang sits in the far northwest of China, in a thin green oasis surrounded on almost every side by desert. To the west lies the Taklamakan, a sea of sand so feared that its name was said to mean, "Go in and you will not come out." To the north and east stretches the Gobi. This is one of the driest, most punishing landscapes on the continent. And yet, for over 1,000 years, this was one of the most important places in the world. The reason is a single word. The Silk Road. This was not one road, but a web of ancient trade routes running for thousands of miles, connecting China to Central Asia, India, Persia, and eventually Rome. Along it moved silk and paper heading west, and gold, glass, horses, and ideas heading east. But the Silk Road did not run in a straight line. It bent around deserts and mountains, and it depended on oases, precious islands of water where a caravan could rest, resupply, and survive. Dunhuang was the great gateway oasis. It sat at the point where the road split to go around the Taklamakan, north or south. Every merchant, every monk, every soldier moving between China and the west funneled through here. Whoever you were, before you plunged into the desert, or just after you crawled out of it alive, you passed through Dunhuang. Just beyond the oasis stood the gates of an empire. To the west lay the Jade Gate and the Yang Pass, ancient checkpoints where Chinese territory ended and the unknown began. Long lines of rammed earth beacon towers, part of the western reach of the Great Wall, marched out into the emptiness, ready to send columns of smoke racing back toward the capital at the first sign of raiders. For a Chinese traveler, Dunhuang was the last taste of home. For a foreign one, it was the first door into the richest empire on earth. And what moved through that door was not only goods. Silk, jade, and spices crossed here, yes. But so did technologies, faiths, alphabets, music, and disease. The Silk Road was the internet of the ancient world, and Dunhuang was one of its great servers, a place where everything passing between civilizations left a trace. Stand at Dunhuang today and you can still see why people believe this place was blessed. Just outside the town rise the Mingsha sand dunes, mountains of pure sand hundreds of feet high, that hum and roar when the wind moves across them. And nestled impossibly among them lies the Crescent Lake, a curved sliver of spring water that has sat in the throat of the dunes for over 2,000 years and, against all logic, has never been buried by the sand. Picture what it meant to arrive here. A caravan of camels, weeks out from the last real city, moving through a land of blinding heat by day and biting cold by night, past the bleached bones of animals and men who had not made it. The desert did not just kill with thirst. It killed with sandstorms that swallowed whole caravans, with mirages, with the sheer crushing emptiness of it. And then, on the horizon, a line of green. Water. Shade. Safety. For a traveler who had just survived that, or was about to face it, Dunhuang was a place where water appeared in the middle of sand, and the earth itself seemed to sing. It is not hard to see why they thought the divine lived here. And so, on a cliff just southeast of the oasis, they began to carve. Chapter 2. 1,000 years on a wall. The Mogao Caves were not built all at once. They grew, one cave at a time, over almost 1,000 years. The tradition says it began in the year 366, when a wandering monk had a vision of 1,000 Buddhas shining in golden light above this cliff. He carved the first cave as a place to meditate. Others followed. And once the idea took hold, it never stopped. For the next 10 centuries, through one dynasty after another, people kept cutting new caves into the rock and covering them in art. Here is why it matters. A merchant about to cross the desert, or one who had just made it through, was a person staring straight at death and then at deliverance. Faith was not abstract to them. It was survival. So the wealthy, the pilgrims, and the passing traders paid for caves to be carved and painted, as prayers, as thanks, as insurance for the soul. Each cave was an act of devotion, and a receipt for a promise made to heaven. And consider how they were made, because the how is its own quiet miracle. The cliff at Mogao is not hard granite. It is a soft, crumbly conglomerate of gravel and sand, far too rough to carve fine detail into directly. So the builders worked around it. They hollowed out each cave by hand, then coated the rough walls in layers of mud mixed with straw and plant fiber, smoothed to a fine surface, and painted on top of that. The great statues were not always cut from solid rock either. Many were built up over a wooden or stone core, packed with straw and clay, and then painted. These are not monuments of stone. They are monuments of mud, held together by faith and dry air. The colors came from across that same trade network. Deep blues from crushed lapis lazuli carried from what is now Afghanistan. Greens from malachite. Reds from cinnabar and ochre. Ground into powder, bound, and brushed onto the walls, these mineral pigments do not fade the way plant dyes do. That is why, more than 1,000 years later, the robes of the Buddhas still burn blue and gold in the lamplight. The result is staggering. Today, Mogao holds nearly 500 surviving decorated caves. Inside them are more than 2,000 painted clay statues and around 45,000 square meters of murals. If you could line those wall paintings up in a single strip, they would stretch for miles. And they span the rise and fall of dynasty after dynasty, from the Northern Way, through the golden age of the Tang, to the Song and beyond, each leaving its own style layered onto the cliff, so that walking the caves is like walking 1,000 years of history in an afternoon. And the art is not one style. Because Dunhuang sat on the Silk Road, its caves absorbed everything that passed through. You can see Indian and Central Asian faces in the early Buddhas, Greek and Persian patterns in the borders, and later, the full-flowing elegance of Chinese court painting. A single cliff became a 1,000-year record of how cultures met, blended, and changed, painted layer over layer. Look up in the great caves and you see them everywhere. The Apsaras. Celestial beings, flying musicians and dancers, drifting weightless across the ceilings on ribbons of cloth, scattering flowers over the heads of the Buddhas. They had become the signature image of Dunhuang, figures caught forever in mid-flight, painted by artists who never signed their names. And the scale ranges from the tiny to the colossal. In one cave sits a Buddha over 100 feet tall, carved into the cliff so that worshippers far below are dwarfed at its feet. In others, thousands of tiny Buddhas cover the walls in endless repeated rows, the 1,000 Buddhas that give the caves their name. For 1,000 years, this was a living place. Monks prayed here. Artists worked here by the light of oil lamps. Pilgrims climbed the cliff to leave offerings. And then, at some point, one small cave was quietly sealed shut, and the memory of what was inside it slipped away. Chapter 3. The Sealed Library. For 900 years, no one knew it was there. The Mogao Caves declined as the Silk Road faded. When ships began to carry trade by sea, the overland desert routes lost their reason to exist. Dunhuang slipped from a world crossroads back into a remote frontier town. The caves were still visited, but many were half forgotten, their entrances filling with drifting sand. Then, in 1900, a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu, who had appointed himself caretaker of the crumbling caves, was clearing sand from a passage when he noticed something. A crack in a painted wall. Behind it was a hidden doorway, and behind that, a small room, packed floor to ceiling. Inside were tens of thousands of manuscripts. Scrolls, books, and paintings, sealed away and untouched for roughly 9 centuries. It is now called the Library Cave, and it held one of the greatest document discoveries in human history, close to 50,000 items, in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, and languages that had not been read in 1,000 years. Among them was a single printed scroll of a Buddhist text called the Diamond Sutra. It carries a date matching the year 868, which makes it the earliest complete printed book in the world that we can put a firm date on, printed with carved wooden blocks nearly 600 years before Gutenberg pressed a single page in Europe. And no one is completely sure why it was sealed. One idea is that the room was a sacred storeroom, a place to retire worn-out and damaged holy texts that were too sacred to simply throw away. Another is that as the threat of invasion loomed in the 11th century, the monks walled up their most precious documents to protect them, meaning to return, and never did. Whatever the reason, they sealed the door, plastered a painting over it, and the desert kept the secret for the next 900 years. Think about what this room was. Not a treasury of gold, but a snapshot of the mind of an entire age. Prayers, contracts, medical texts, folk stories, marriage records, loan agreements, letters, and star charts, the ordinary and the sacred, sealed together and preserved perfectly by the dry desert air. One of the charts inside is among the oldest known star maps in the world, the night sky of the Silk Road drawn by hand. And here is the part that still stings. Wang Yuanlu, a poor caretaker, tried to alert Chinese officials to what he had found. They were fighting other fires, and little was done. But word reached the wider world, and foreign explorers came. The British archaeologist Aurel Stein arrived in 1907 and, for a modest sum handed to Wang Yuanlu, carried away thousands of the finest manuscripts, bound for the British Museum. The French scholar Paul Pelliot followed and, fluent in classical Chinese, sat in the cave by candlelight and hand-picked thousands more of the rarest and most valuable texts. Explorers from Russia, Japan, and America came after them, each leaving with their share. It is easy to cast Stein and Pelliot as simple thieves, and easy to cast Wang as a fool who sold a nation's heritage for pocket change. The truth is heavier. Wang used the money to fund repairs to the very caves he was trying to save. The scholars believed they were rescuing manuscripts from neglect and decay. And the Chinese state, weak and distracted in its final imperial years, did too little, too late. There is no clean villain here, only a priceless library caught in a collapsing empire, and a world that arrived to carry it off before anyone thought to protect it. Within a decade, the greatest library of the Silk Road had been broken up and shipped to London, Paris, St. Petersburg, and beyond. Today the treasures of that single sealed room are scattered across more than a dozen countries. To study the library of Dunhuang, you now have to travel the world. Chapter 4. The question in the sand. There is a temptation to tell the story of Dunhuang as a tragedy. A treasure lost, a room empty, a heritage carried off. And part of that is true. But stand back from the cliff and something larger comes into view. Dunhuang was never really about one room, or even about China alone. It was about what happens when the whole world passes through a single point. This was a place where an Indian religion, Buddhism, was carried by Central Asian merchants, painted by artists using Persian pigments and Greek forms, and recorded in Chinese ink, all on the edge of a Chinese desert. Dunhuang is not the achievement of one civilization. It is the fingerprint of many, pressed into one cliff over 1,000 years. That is why the scattering, painful as it is, could not erase it. The manuscripts survive, even if they now sit in glass cases half a world apart. The caves survive, their colors still glowing in the dark. And in the last few decades, scholars have begun to digitally photograph every wall of every cave in extraordinary detail, capturing each brushstroke before the fragile mud and pigment can decay any further. At the same time, institutions across the world have started to scan their scattered Dunhuang manuscripts and pool them into a single shared archive online. Piece by piece, the library that was broken apart and shipped to a dozen countries is being reassembled, page by page, in digital form, so that the collection sealed in the year 1000 can finally be read whole again, on a screen, by anyone on Earth. So here is the question the desert leaves you with. We tend to think of great civilizations as things that rise alone, walled off, pure, and self-made. Dunhuang says the opposite. Its greatness came from being a crossroads, from letting the ideas of strangers wash through it for 1,000 years and painting every one of them onto the rock. What if the things we are proudest of were never really ours alone? What if the richest culture is not the one that keeps the world out, but the one brave enough to let the whole world in? The monks of Dunhuang carved their answer into a desert cliff and covered it in the faces of 1,000 gods, from a dozen different lands. The sand has been trying to bury it for 1,000 years, one storm at a time. So far, it has not managed to.